Hi, this is Paul, and this is part 2 of chapter 1 of the Abolition of Man. And in my last video, I reached into the new Daniel Dennett, Keith Ward conversation, and I made the point that both authors are trying to figure out, okay, meaning. Where is meaning? What kind of a thing is meaning? And again, for Jordan Peterson, this is the work that he's been doing forever. Or where can we locate this meaning? And so in a sense, when Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris are talking about, is there meaning in the glass that Elton John drank from, or meaning in the guitar that Elvis played, or meaning in the land that they're fighting over in the Middle East? Well, one of the issues that you get into very quickly is we experience meaning as a feeling, but very quickly in a reductionist system, all meaning is a feeling. And so when I go and see a waterfall, I feel that, well, what? Sublime means what? I feel sublime? No, I feel humble. I feel, and what I've been arguing for is that there's beauty out there that we are built to apprehend, and that is built into the system. And not only beauty, but good and evil and meaning, that this is all part of it. But the difficulty that you're having is this simply a feeling? Because if you say it's a feeling, then you're pretty much just left open to relativism. And what that means is relativism says, well, if I feel meaning committing genocide, that's just as good as you feeling meaning stopping my genocide, because all we're left with are two people feeling meanings. Now, actually, in the second Vancouver debate, this gets brought into this part of the conversation. So I'm going to play some of that.
We're wired to feel intense empathy for individuals who are close to us, and we can be told stories in a manner that makes that system manifest itself.
Okay, so we're told stories that makes us feel empathy. But now, again, what we do when we say this is we forget the larger frame. Well, why do you want to tell stories? And they just had this conversation where if you show one child on TV, everyone will want to sponsor that child. We saw this in the Dominican Republic. If you show two children on TV, the empathy level goes. If you say 1,000 children are in danger of starvation, you'll actually get less money. And Sam Harris is saying, well, this is a bug in our wiring. Okay. Why do you think it's a bug? Because you have a standard that says, well, if 1,000 children are suffering, that's worse than one child suffering. Again, now get into the equality. What is this progressive? What is this progressive Epicureanism value? What is its goal? Its goal is, well, its goal is feeling equality. So all of us should have the same feelings, and meaning is a feeling, and well-being is a feeling, and if we see something beautiful, we get a feeling, but it's all about the feelings. It's all about what's in here. And the question is there something out there? Is there moral value? And C.S. Lewis asked the question, are there predicates of value? Can they exist? That's the question in the first bit of the first chapter of the Abolition of Man. Can we use predicates of value in terms of, is there value out there? And is it the case that there is value out there and we are built, just like with our eyes, we're built to see things on certain wavelengths and we're built to compute that. Are we built to see and feel and touch and taste meaning and then act on this so that we, in fact, when we see the suffering child, respond with generosity? That's the traditional understanding of the system, that there is a moral problem out there that's independent of my feelings to which I must respond. And this is what they're trying to sort through, the three of them here.
And everyone and their dog thinks that that's a wonderful thing, and we call that empathy.
Their dog doesn't think it's a wonderful thing. I understand the turn of phrase, but that's critical.
Right? And empathy has a narrow domain of utility, as it turns out, because maybe if you were all...
And Peterson has reduced it to the feeling, because this is in our culture, the cultural conversation is, well, everyone should feel empathy. Okay, I don't have a problem with the empathy word, but why are you using the should word? Show me where your should comes from in that. Well, we all know. Okay, yeah, I agree with you, but your instincts are better than the system you imagine it's built on.
Who you should be, you'd be weeping constantly for the catastrophic fate of sentient beings on the earth, but you can't handle it. You know what I mean? It's that you can barely handle your own suffering, and maybe you can handle a bit of the suffering of your family, and more power to you if you could rectify that, and if you were better human beings, maybe you could expand that outwards. But the fact that our empathy doesn't scale up to the level of genocide with the same intensity that we treat instances of individual suffering isn't an indication that we're irrational. It's just an indication that we're limited.
Well,
now, you also mentioned that
that's not true. I think this is an indication of exactly the problem of our evolved structures not matching the present. Because the point is...
Well, they do match because we take care of our families.
No, but they don't match because if you...
Now, what's interesting again is our evolved structures don't match the present. Well, how don't they match? Well, again, is meaning, is the ought to help these suffering children, is that simply a function of my feelings? Because, well, cold-hearted people can look at that and say, I don't know those children anything. Enemies or rivals could look at that and say, I'm glad their children are suffering. Where does that ought? Where does that should? Where do all these three men on the stage agree that empathy is something we should feel that corresponds to something out there? And they're trying to figure that out. That's what they're doing. Now, no, did I close it? No, I didn't. Okay. Let's pick this up. And here, Gaius and Titius, while teaching him nothing about letters, have cut out his soul. Well, what does that mean? What is Lewis saying? Well, yes, you should care for that suffering child, not only the one, but the 1,000. Well, why? Well, yes, that's the question. Why? And in past generations, our chest, our heart, our feelings, not just our guts, not just our head, but our heart, we assume has been oriented to something out there in the universe that is true and real. In fact, it's so real, we will die for it. And those who die for it, we esteem. In other words, when we have Labor Day or Memorial Day, and we pay, listen to the language, we pay honor to those who have given their life for us. What have we just done? Is it just about the feeling? Or do we say that some transaction happened? Well, here's the question. Can your philosophical tradition account for that transaction? And what Lewis is saying is that subtly in the language, we're destroying it. And we're destroying it because we're saying it's just a feeling.
Little book, whose author I will call Orbilius, I find that the same operation under the same general anesthetic is being carried out. Orbilius...
Now, Lewis, again, under the anesthetic, what does that mean? It means that these very bad English teachers who are in fact ignoring what they're supposed to be doing by teaching them English, by showing how the poor writing in this advertisement is in fact poor writing. And Lewis says you can line this up next to good writing and say the advertisement is terrible writing. But they're not interested in that at all. What are they interested in? They're interested in smuggling their philosophy under the text. And the teachers might not know it. The students don't know it. And what you're doing is the crowd is building up, all the elephants under the riders are building up suspicion that, you know what? It's just feelings. When I feel empathy, it doesn't mean that I should care for that village of suffering children, not just triggering my mirror neurons when I see a suffering child on TV. You see, what Weinstein and Peterson and Harris are actually struggling with is the biology. And it's not actually the system That's the problem. It's the reduction to biology, because biology says, I see the face of one suffering child and my heart goes out. Okay, that's just the biology. I hear about 1,000 children suffering. I hear about the children of my enemies suffering, and I ought to do something. That's not biology. Those are value predicates. Those are this thing, this meaning, this beauty, this real world out there that is far more than information, as Daniel Dennett says. This is, in fact, what we live for. It's, in fact, what human beings have always lived for.
Orbilius chooses for debunking a silly bit of writing on horses, where these animals are praised as the willing servants of the early colonists in Australia. And he falls into the same trap as Gaius and Titius. Of Raksh and Slipnir, and the weeping horses of Achilles, and the war horse in the book of Job, nay, even of Brer Rabbit and of Peter Rabbit, of man's prehistoric piety to our brother the ox, of all that this semi-anthropomorphic treatment of beasts has meant in human history, and of the literature where it finds noble or piquant expression, he has not a word to say. Even of the problems of animal psychology as they exist for science, he says nothing. He contents himself with explaining that horses are not secundum litteram.
Okay, now remember, all of these Latinisms are on the website, and you can pull them up. They are not the discussion of secundum litteram. Expressions refer to expressions that are not literally true, and that's what we're talking about. Because Harris wants to talk, well, we want to reduce the world to that which is literally true. And that's now the test that we're going to apply to everything. And this is the modernist fundamentalist split, where the assumption comes underneath the radar that the only truth is the literal truth. So what about these horses? Well, you know what? They're just horses. But what does that mean? What does it justify when we decide that they are just horses? Because pretty quickly, human beings are going to be just trousered apes.
Secundum litteram, interested in colonial expansion. This piece of information is really all that his pupils get from him. Why the composition before them is bad, when others that lie open to the same charge are good, they do not hear. Much less do they learn of the two classes of men who are, respectively, above and below the danger of such writing. The man who really knows horses and really loves them, not with anthropomorphic illusions, but with ordinate love.
Okay, now that's Augustine's key thing, ordinate love. But what he's saying is, just like he said with the patriotism in the previous video, is that this slippage that happens, there's people who are both above and below what's happening here. The people above it, the true patriot, knows it's a noble thing to die for your country. Well, why is it a noble thing? Well, they can't answer that. Well, and then you're going to go into all kinds of, and actually Lewis will go into this, all kinds of arguments like Matt Dillahunty goes into, because my ancestors figured out it was a noble thing, so that idea just kind of got passed down to me through DNA. Wow, that DNA can sure carry a lot of things, including ideas, huh? Well, how does that work? So that's one reduction. And so the patriot knows, well, the patriot has a heart. He has a chest. The person underneath it just debunks everything, and they're just in it for themselves.
Ordinate love, and the irredeemable urban blockhead to whom a horse is merely an old-fashioned means of transport. Some pleasure in their own ponies and dogs they will have lost. Some incentive to cruelty or neglect they will have received. Some pleasure in their own knowingness will have entered their minds. That is their day's lesson in English, though of English they have learned nothing. Another little portion of the human heritage has been quietly taken from them before they were old enough to understand.
And again, my point about cultures. A good culture, or good parents, allow for children to behave with wisdom they have not in their life had time to acquire. This is what human beings do and how they bless successive generations. And as Lewis says, what's the philosophical smuggling going on in these works are robbing future generations, actually, not only of what they might enjoy, but what they will need.
I have hitherto been assuming that such teachers as Gaius and Titius do not fully realize what they are doing and do not intend the far-reaching consequences it will actually have. There is, of course, another possibility. What I have called, presuming on their concurrence in a certain traditional system of values, the trousered ape and the urban blockhead may be precisely the kind of man they really wish to produce. The differences between us may go all the way down. They may really hold that the ordinary human feelings about the past, or animals, or large waterfalls, are contrary to reason and contemptible, and ought to be eradicated.
That's pretty much what Sam Harris, how he diagnoses the Middle Eastern conflict. Oh, they're just fighting about land. The world would be better if they just fight about land. Jordan Peterson jumps in and says, hey, wait a minute. It's also about family. Because this root goes down not just to connections with land or connection with little cookie tins, because a friend of mine sent me a gift from the Netherlands. It goes all the way down to the love of our children and our ability to sacrifice for them. And as Peterson and Weinstein and Harris get into, it also goes into the question of, okay, so maybe there's a biological reason why I will go in and get my own child out. But what is the reason that I will risk my life for the sake of a stranger's child, or a stranger, or in fact an enemy? That's the question. Yeah, the mirror neuron with the weeping girl who's starving on TV. Yeah, I can understand how that works. That's biology. But to care for the child of my enemy, that I ought to do so, where does that come from in a world where we know that female chimps will kill the young offspring of rival females within their own troop if they get the chance? That's our biology. But now we imagine we ought to transcend and get to a better place. Of what is this better place you speak of? Unless there is actually meaning and beauty, and we can actually use predicates of value. Well, we might want a philosophical system that can actually afford them.
They may be intending to make a clean sweep of traditional values and start with a new set. That position will be discussed later. If it is the position which Gaius and Titius are holding, I must for the moment content myself with pointing out that it is a philosophical and not a literary position. In filling their book with it, they have been unjust to the parent or headmaster who buys it and who has got the work of amateur philosophers where he expected the work of professional grammarians. A man would be annoyed if his son returned from the dentist with his teeth untouched and his head crammed with the dentist's obiter dicta.
Obiter dicta. Lewis is so funny. Obiter dicta. A thing said incidentally, an unofficial expression of opinion. In other words, what Lewis is saying is that Gaius and Titius, they're just filling the minds of their students, cutting out their chests just on incidentally. And actually, well, they may be intending to do much more.
Obiter dicta on bimetallism or the Baconian theory. But I doubt whether Gaius and Titius have really planned, under cover of teaching English, to propagate their philosophy. I think they have slipped into it for the following reasons. In the first place, literary criticism is difficult, and what they actually do is very much easier.
And that's exactly right. It's easy. Well, what are they doing? They're simply propagating their philosophy. They are passing along the things that have come under the radar from the other elements. And in fact, most of what we do with each other comes in at this level. This is how we communicate. And this, in fact, is exactly what I should pull up that video. This is the video. It's Dallas Willard, The Nature and Necessity of Worldviews from the Veritas Forum. And here he gets into it. It's a terrific video.
Briefly, the sociological side of the aspect.
Of worldview.
Because the truth of the matter is we have those two areas to deal with. And the person who is absolutely convinced of the things that Dr. Coons has said can still be embarrassed at being thought unscientific. Whereas if they really absorbed what he had to say and were really concerned about truth and research and all that sort of thing, they would say, well, you know, that's no different from being thought un-Republican or something of that sort.
That's that sociological thing. These are the tribes that we have, and it's very deep within the elephant to stay in that tribe.
And so you see, what we're dealing with here is the power of worldview. And I want to try to make as clear as possible what this is and talk about how it works in our context. So you'll be following along up here, and I think all of you have a sheet to make some notes on, just in case you need to write something down. I will enlarge a little bit on this. Let's just begin with the idea of worldview. The basic idea of worldview, as you see here, is your worldview consists of your assumptions about the realities and values that govern you and the world in which you live. Now let me illustrate it. How many of you here tonight worried that coming to this meeting you would be eaten by a dinosaur? May I see your hands? Oh, we got one over here. I think he's faking.
Willard's a pretty corny guy.
See, that reflects your worldview. That dinosaurs aren't there. Or to mention another reference to Steve Weinberg, I've heard him say, for example, that when he goes to do his research, he doesn't worry about fairies. He says, well, you know, it's logically possible, but he doesn't worry about it. Well, that's his worldview. See, his worldview is basically your assumptions. Now, you see, there not being any dinosaurs on the UCLA campus is a part of your worldview, even though you didn't think about it.
And this is exactly in a sense, the time bomb that, or the leaching of the idea that these English professors are putting in the textbooks.
That's an important thing to understand about worldviews, is that you don't have to think about them in order for them to determine your behavior. Now we need to just sort of let that soak in, because you can't live without a worldview. And that's why I say on the screen here, a world.
When you get into Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and these conversations, this is this a priori filter. It's a biological reality. It's built into your usual actions and responses.
Worldview is a biological reality. That is to say, it's built right into your life. It's built into your body. Your body responds in terms of your worldview, whether you think about it or not. Right? And so your worldview is most clearly seen in the things you don't think about and talk about. And partly because, you know, if you have to think about and talk about all the stuff that determines your actions, you're dead. You can't get across the street.
This is what Jordan Peterson was saying. This is 2006 he's talking.
That's that we're made to be biological units and live in a world with a kind of unified 360-degree orientation, which very often is far removed from our conscious thinking.
And this is where we get into, well, atheists who believe in God and God believers who live like atheists. It's our worldview. It's packed into us.
And that's the picture of the person who doesn't want to, I mean, if someone, we have philosophers, for example, who if they thought that someone they respected thought they were unscientific, they wouldn't sleep at night. They'd sit up and worry about it. Even though, as Dr. Coons has shown, there really is no unified, consistent picture of what it means to be scientific in general. A physicist, yes. A chemist, yes. A physiologist, stretch it a little bit, an economist, that's, sociologist. You won't get all the way over to English literature with that one. But still, I mean, there is a solid meaning to science as long as you're talking about a particular science. And scientists, when they're about their work as a physicist or whatever, they don't generally worry about worldviews, but they still have one. And then we carry one, as academic people, we kind of carry a rather ragtag, unexamined set of assumptions about the world, and often we palm them off on science. Since it's just after Easter, I remember a few years ago, a very, very bright young man, a philosophy major and an outstanding Christian, was walking along with one of our professors from the religion department. And this young man brought up the issue of the resurrection of Christ. And the professor said, well, of course that couldn't have happened because that would be contrary to the laws of physics. Now this young man, he wasn't in a position to say, well, now, Professor, which law was that? Would you just help me work through that with me? See? But that's a part of that professor's worldview. And it's totally groundless. I mean, some interesting connection could be made. I don't mean to deny that. But to just say, well, it's contrary to the laws of physics. Well, which one? Right? And now, regularly in teaching courses in philosophy, I will have to challenge my students just to help them out with this, to say, now go to your chemistry professor and ask him for a reference to a refereed journal that shows that people do not survive the death of their brain. Now, of course, they don't do it because they'd be scared to death to do it. You see, there isn't any technical journal in chemistry that proves or even attempts to prove that people do not survive the death of their brain. You can't get an engagement with the issue because you have a worldview. Now, our work is about knowledge. And that's the second screen you have there. We want to talk a little bit about knowledge and truth. And the university is supposed to be about knowledge. That's what you're here you're doing your work. I don't know whether you're undergraduate or graduate or whatever, but you're trying to gain knowledge. And one might say that that is what the university is about, is the gaining of knowledge. And one might also think that knowledge involves truth, that you cannot know what isn't true. But you see that one of the ironies about our Veritas Forum is Veritas is, it's kind of nice to put it in Latin. I don't know how it would work if we had a truth forum. And the fact is that truth is in trouble. Now, not just religious or moral truth, but truth. And it's a little embarrassing. And, we need to think deeply about that. I quote here a sentence from the WASC, that stands for Western Association of Schools and Colleges. They're the people that come around and decide whether or not your degree is any good. And I occasionally serve on these site committees. Some of you probably do the same, faculty here. And here's what they say. An institution of higher education is, by definition, dedicated to the search for truth and its dissemination. Now, Harvard actually had a little problem with this through the years in deciding what to do with truth, and they've changed their shield a number of times. Primarily, they were troubled about the issue of the unity of truth. And that is, does truth include the religious, the moral, and the other dimensions of truth? And gradually, through the years, there has been a kind of de facto drift in university affairs that relegates truth to just the natural world, shall we say. And so then our ability to represent God, personal character of the human being, spiritual side, all of that is eliminated from knowledge. But truth itself does not do that. I mean, I've given here a statement of what a truth is. A thought or statement is true if what it is about is as that thought or statement represents it. So have you got a quarter in your pocket? You say, well, yes, I've got a quarter in my pocket. Well, that statement will be true if indeed your pocket has a quarter in it. Right? How can you get more elemental than that? But that's the general nature of truth. And truth is involved in knowledge because knowledge is our capacity to represent things as they are on an appropriate basis of thought and experience. And that can include authority. Nearly everything we know is known on the basis of authority. Do you know that the playoffs have now begun in the NBA? Well, some of you, I think, didn't know that. Well, take my word for it. It has. And so that's the general character of knowledge and truth. And we do need to reflect on that. And we need to understand that truth does not accommodate belief. Belief has to accommodate truth. No one has ever made a proposition true simply by believing it. Now, maybe their belief in it caused them to act and to bring something about that made the proposition true. But merely believing doesn't make propositions true. A group of people believing it doesn't help get up a movement, get a grant. It won't make it true. Right? 1 million Frenchmen have been wrong. 1 million Americans have been wrong. So the bitterness of truth is its total indifference to human will and desire, together with the fact that human desire and will is set on reshaping the truth. This is the fundamental conflict in human life, is the conflict between desire or will and truth. And that conflict affects everything we do, including what we do on the university campus. So now, when it comes to these worldview questions, you see the same issue of truth is there. And the question of how do we know the truth still applies to those, not just about whether in your pocket, but for example, whether you're going to continue conscious existence when your brain is no longer functioning. Right? That's a good question of fact. And now, how we settle that, that's a difficult thing to argue about. But if it is true, then it's true regardless of what you or I may think about it. I often shock my students, we're discussing Descartes or someone, I ask them, what if it turns out you can't stop existing? Well, I mean, there you have Hamlet's problem, don't you? He wasn't sure he could make an end of himself with a bare bodkin, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, right? So now here's a question of fact or truth. And it has incredible bearings on how we approach our life. Am I fundamentally a material object that exists, gets organized by DNA and exists for a little while and then I stop existing? Or am I an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's universe? Wow, what a difference, see? Now, the main worldview questions, we can go on to slide 5. Basically, you can boil them down to 3. You can add a couple more.
And this will get into a fair amount of Willard stuff. I really wanted to get to the point, I haven't watched this video in a while, where he talks about how worldviews are translated.
And enables us to negotiate to it. I often do pleasant experience, and it's not there. Is a human being, go back to the case I'm using to illustrate, are they just a physical organism? And I don't think it's major questions. I, of course, students at UCLA, because they have a bright future, right? And that's at USC, we promise everyone they're going to be successful. But this is a profound question. Who is well off? And can you still be well off if you have cancer? Or if you don't get your PhD? Or you don't have enough money to go on and get your BA degree? Can you still be well off? Who is well off? And that is a profound worldview question that reflects itself in nearly everything that we do. Who is a really good person? That's another big one. Actually, people are more concerned about that one than they are about who's well off. You can get a fight out of someone by questioning whether they're a really good person much quicker than you can by questioning whether they're well off. You know, you say, well, you must not be well off. You don't drive a Lexus. They'll look at you and shrug. But I can give you some other language that they will fight you right quickly, you see. So that's one of the deep questions. Am I a good person? It's one of the deepest worldview questions that human beings deal with. They're constantly concerned about it. If you have any doubts about it, your blood pressure will immediately go up.
And why is that?
Right. I mean, try it. I am a stinker. Blood pressure goes up, right? Or even Joe thinks I'm a stinker, right? Blood pressure goes up. I mean, these are really pervasive questions that trouble us all the time. Well, let me hasten on. I mean, the truth of the matter is, I mean, we could list others, like how do you get to be a good person? That's a good one. Questions about what counts as knowledge is very big on the campus. See, those are worldview questions. They organize our lives as a whole. Now, what I want to say is that all teaching institutions, great teachers, even little teachers, give answers to these questions.
They get snuck in, okay? Who is the good person? The good person says that there's no such thing as value out there, it's just feelings. That gets transmitted to students. They all figure who's good and who's not, who's considered smart, who's considered, on point.
And I mention here Jesus, because he's one of the most obvious people to mention. There never has been anyone who has been more influential in his teaching about these things than Jesus. But of course, he's not the only one. Plato, the Buddha, Freud, and UCLA. UCLA answers these questions. They convey an impression of the truth of a certain worldview. In the university setting, the dominating worldview is expressed through what is accepted as research and what counts as possible knowledge. So I ask you about the dinosaur and whether or not any of you thought about being eaten by one on the way here tonight. No. Well, let me give you another one. Is there a single course of studies on this campus? And I don't, I'm just picking on you because that's where we are. USC, Berkeley, or wherever it is, all the same. Is there a single course of studies on this campus that you're engaged in that regards knowledge of God as a part of the subject matter? A single one. Where you might be a part of your expertise in that field, or your grade might be determined by something you had to say about God. You see, that's the sociological reality. What Dr. Kuhn said is so cogent and so forceful, and when you
And they didn't record what Dr. Kuhn said, which was a huge pity.
know, you understand what he said. You just wonder, how can people not understand this? But the truth of the matter is, people who are caught up in the sociological wave will hear it all and dismiss it, because to them it's just like the dinosaur. And what I want to do this evening especially is to just take the time to insist that you are in a system which teaches a worldview without responsibly defending it. How is a worldview taught? Well, mainly it's taught by body language, facial expressions, tones of voice and inflections, looks, offhand remarks about people and events, by what is permissible, by example, how we treat people in class, out-of-class colleagues, by who gets rewarded or punished in various ways in the academic or other contexts. Almost never is worldview taught by explicit statement. It is modeled.
It is by what we do. It is by how we act. It is by the status hierarchies that we create. That is how worldview is taught. In church, in university, in the family, in your neighborhood, on the street, everywhere.
Explicit statement is usually happens only to reinforce what is taught indirectly in the ways just indicated above.
And you can watch Willard. But this is exactly Lewis's point about Gaius and Titius.
To explain why a bad treatment of some basic human emotion is bad literature is, if we exclude all question-begging attacks on the emotion itself, a very hard thing to do. Even Dr. Richards, who first seriously tackled the problem of badness in literature, failed, I think, to do it. To debunk the emotion on the basis of a commonplace rationalism is within almost anyone's capacity. In the second place, I think Gaius and Titius may have honestly misunderstood the pressing educational need of the moment. They see the world around them swayed by emotional propaganda. They have learned from tradition that youth is sentimental, and they conclude that the best thing they can do is to fortify the minds of young people against emotion.
And this is not far from Sam Harris. Well, these Christians out there, they have these emotions, they have these ideas, they're doing these things. We need to get rid of these emotions, and we need to be rational. Now, science seems to have moved on beyond Mr. Spock, imagining that if we are emotionless, we will be rational. No, we're more sophisticated now. We've learned something here. But this hasn't changed so much.
Emotion. My own experience as a teacher tells an opposite tale. For every one pupil who needs to be guarded from a weak excess of sensibility, there are 3 who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. By starving the sensibility of our pupils, we only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes.
Because remember, Lewis is saying, there's actually predicates of value out there. Meaning is out there. Beauty is out there. Courage is out there. It exists out in the world. And what we need to do is educate people to live up to it, to be courageous, to know the truth, to understand the good. And as Dallas Willard says, well, universities have given up on that, except now what has changed between 2006 and 2018 in terms of the university is now a new religion has come in, which is saying, this is what's good. But shall we examine this? Oh, no, there must not be any examination. Well, that's exactly the problem. Because the problem with religious hierarchies, as Sam Harris clearly says, they're not subject to examination. But now we have a new religious hierarchy, only they don't call themselves religious. This is just justice and goodness and fairness, but do not examine what's underneath it. You may not do that. Well, that's an old religious trick, and that's why I, as a religious person, watch this and think, I know these tricks. I've seen them my whole life long. Religious people have all played these tricks. No, let's use reason. Let's talk. Let's examine.
For famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. But there is a third and a profounder reason for the procedure which Gaius and Titius adopt. They may be perfectly ready to admit that a good education should build some sentiments while destroying others. They may endeavor to do so, but it is impossible that they should succeed. Do what they will, it is the debunking side of their work, and this side alone, which will really tell. In order to grasp this necessity clearly, I must digress for a moment to show that what may be called the educational predicament of Gaius and Titius is different from that of all their predecessors. Until quite modern times, all teachers, and even all men, believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it, and believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. The reason why Coleridge agreed with the tourist who called the cataract sublime, and disagreed with the one who called it pretty, was of course that he believed inanimate nature to be such that certain responses could be more just or ordinate or appropriate to it than others. And he believed, correctly, that the tourists thought the same. The man who called the cataract sublime was not intending simply to describe his own emotions about it. He was also claiming that the object was one which merited those emotions. But for this claim there would be nothing to agree or disagree about. To disagree with "this is pretty," if those words simply described the lady's feelings, would be absurd. If she had said, "I feel sick," Coleridge would hardly have replied, "No, I feel quite well." When Shelley, having compared the human sensibility to an Aeolian lyre, goes on to add that it differs from a lyre in having a power of internal adjustment, whereby it can accommodate its chords to the motions of that which strikes them, he is assuming the same belief. "Can you be righteous," asks Traherne, "unless you be just in rendering to things their due esteem? All things were made to be yours, and you were made to prize them according to their value."
Again, what's he talking about? He's saying everyone in the world, up until this point, it seems, have had the assumption that there is goodness, that there is value, that when the man bursts into the home to save the child of his enemy, that this is an act to be valued and held up as noble, that this is an example of something out there that exists, that action corresponds to something. Now we might say, well, he would go in for his own child because that's mere biology, but there's something beyond biology that we strive to live up to. And you'll hear Harris or Weinstein both assume that this is built into the world. And when we say we have to transcend our chimpanzee morality, that's what they're talking about. And it is transcultural, it is transreligious. C.S. Lewis is going to call it the Tao, but we're not there yet.
Their value. St. Augustine defines virtue as ordo amoris.
Ordered love.
Amoris, the ordinate condition of the affections in which every object is accorded that kind of degree of love which is appropriate to it.
Now, one of the things that you might pay attention to during the Harris, the Jordan Peterson Harris thing is how little love comes up. See, Augustine turns that on its head and says, no, this is actually all about love, because what we do is about what we desire. And so if you really want to get to that level, you have to talk about desires, not just these abstractions.
Appropriate to it. Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. When the age for reflective thought comes, the pupil who has been thus trained in ordinate affections or just sentiments will easily find the first principles in ethics. But to the corrupt man they will never be visible at all, and he can make no progress in that science. Plato before him had said the same. The little human animal will not at first have the right responses. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which really are pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful. In the Republic, the well-nurtured youth is one who would see most clearly whatever was amiss in ill-made works of man or ill-grown works of nature, and with a just distaste would blame and hate the ugly even from his earliest years, and would give delighted praise to beauty, receiving it into his soul and being nourished by it, so that he becomes a man of gentle heart.
Notice receiving beauty into his soul. Beauty is a thing out there that we apprehend and can in fact receive. And when it comes to some of these other values, our lives should mirror the values that exist out there. That's what we're talking about.
All this before he is of an age to reason, so that when reason at length comes to him, then, bred as he has been.
Notice again, if you're looking at the video, before he's the age of reason, lowercase r, so that when reason, uppercase r. Why does Lewis go the uppercase? Because again, if you go back to miracles, reason is something that comes from above. Reason is a gift to humanity, sort of like in mythology, fire. Lewis, you think, well, Sam Harris is all about Lewis, or Sam Harris is all about reason and not Lewis. Lewis's reason mops up Sam Harris.
And, bred as he has been, he will hold out his hands in welcome and recognize her because of the affinity he bears to her. In early Hinduism, that conduct in men which can be called good consists in conformity to, or almost participation in, the rata.
Go back and listen to what Sam Harris has to say about good and evil in Hinduism. Before Lewis became a Christian, he seriously contemplated becoming a Hindu. He knew Hinduism well. And basically what Lewis is pointing to, which almost any classicist will point to, is that, for the most part, the majority position is that it is the moral duty of the individual to conform themselves to the larger structure that exists. That's pretty cross-cultural.
The rata, that great ritual or pattern of nature and supernature which is revealed alike in the cosmic order, the moral virtues, and the ceremonial of the temple. Righteousness, correctness, order, the rata, is constantly identified with satya, or truth, correspondence to reality. As Plato said that the good was beyond existence, and Wordsworth that through virtue the stars were strong, so the Indian masters say that the gods themselves are born of the rata and obey it. The Chinese also speak of a great thing, the greatest thing, called the Tao. It is the reality beyond all predicates, the abyss that was before the Creator himself. It is nature, it is the way, the road. It is the way in which the universe goes on, the way in which things everlastingly emerge, stilly and tranquilly, into space and time. It is also the way which every man should tread in imitation of that cosmic and supercosmic progression, conforming all activities to that great exemplar. In ritual, say the Analects, it is harmony with nature that is prized. The ancient Jews likewise praised the law as being true.
Okay, now a note to some Christians, because you will find, if you Google this book on the internet, you will find Christians taking shots at it. The Tao is not God for Lewis. If you want to look at it in biblical terms, it's the law. Now read the Psalms about the law, and read the Old Testament about the law. Now, then you're also going to have to read the New Testament about the law, because Paul changes it. So what the Tao is this moral structure to the universe. It is the existence of meaning, and the existence of beauty is the existence of all that. It itself is not God. But it is there, and it is real, and it is more than just mere information.
This conception in all its forms, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian, and Oriental alike, I shall henceforth refer to for brevity simply as the Tao. Some of the accounts of it which I have quoted will seem perhaps to many of you merely quaint or even magical, but what is common to them all is something we cannot neglect. It is the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false, to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are.
That, again, certain attitudes. Okay, attitudes are not mere emotion. They are, when someone exhibits courage, they are exhibiting something that is not simply themselves. Their actions correspond with something deeper than ourselves.
We are. Those who know the Tao can hold that to call children delightful or old men venerable is not simply to record a psychological fact about our own parental or filial emotions at the moment, but to recognize a quality which demands a certain response from us, whether we make it or not. I myself do not enjoy the society of small children. Because I speak from within the Tao, I recognize this as a defect in myself, just as a man may have to recognize that he is tone-deaf or color-blind. And because our approvals and disapprovals are thus recognitions of objective value or responses to an objective order, therefore emotional states can be in harmony with reason when we feel liking for what ought to be approved, or out of harmony with reason when we perceive that liking is due but cannot feel it.
Now again, pay attention. Sam Harris practices this. Bret Weinstein practices this. Jordan Peterson practiced this. But the question that you have for Sam Harris is, does his philosophical system support this? Is it capable of holding this? Does it have the capacity for this? And I would say no. And that's what Sam is trying to do, and he's trying to build it on feelings of well-being and putting your hand in the fire and pulling it out. And that's why in the conversation they say, well, you may rush in and save your own child, but what is it that has you rush into the burning house and save your neighbor's child or even your enemy's child?
Feel it. No emotion is in itself a judgment. In that sense, all emotions and sentiments are illogical. But they can be reasonable or unreasonable, as they conform to reason or fail to conform. The heart,
and again, capital R.
The heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. Over against this stands the world of the Green Book. In it, the very possibility of a sentiment being reasonable or even unreasonable has been excluded from the outset. It can be reasonable or unreasonable only if it conforms or fails to conform to something else. To say that the cataract is sublime means saying that our emotion of humility is appropriate or ordinate to the reality, and thus to speak of something else besides the emotion. Just as to say that a shoe fits is to speak not only of shoes, but of feet. But this reference to something beyond the emotion is what Gaius and Titius exclude from every sentence containing a predicate of value. Such statements, for them, refer solely to the emotion. Now the emotion, thus considered by itself, cannot be either in agreement or disagreement with reason. It is irrational, not as a paralogism is irrational, but as a physical event is irrational. It does not rise even to the dignity of error. On this view, the world of facts, without one trace of value, and the world of feelings, without one trace of truth or falsehood, justice or injustice, confront one another, and no rapprochement is possible. Hence the educational problem is wholly different according as you stand within or without the Tao. For those within, the task is to train in the pupil those responses which are in themselves appropriate, whether anyone is making them or not, and in making which the very nature of man consists. Those without, if they are logical, must regard all sentiments as equally non-rational, as mere mists between us and the real objects. As a result, they must either decide to remove all sentiments, as far as possible, from the pupil's mind, or else to encourage some sentiments for reasons that have nothing to do with their intrinsic justness or ordinacy. The latter course involves them in the questionable process of creating in others by suggestion or incantation a mirage which their own reason has successfully dissipated.
In other words, and this is true of Harris too, Harris wants to say, we shouldn't be religious. Okay. Why shouldn't we? Where is the standard? Well, there's reason. Okay. Why reason? Well, it just is, because reason has brought us cell phones, and reason has brought us all of these wonderful things, and by reason, and then he uses reason, therefore, to debunk a whole bunch of things that he thinks need to be debunked. Okay. But you haven't established for me any objective moral order. Well, it's based on well-being. But now we're back into relativism. Because if my well-being demands this of me, certainly isn't going to have me rush in and save my enemy's child. That's not good for my well-being. What can you appeal to?
Perhaps this will become clearer if we take a concrete instance. When a Roman father told his son that it was a sweet and seemly thing to die for his country, he believed what he said. He was communicating to the son an emotion which he himself shared, and which he believed to be in accord with the value which his judgment discerned in noble death. He was giving the boy the best he had, giving of his spirit to humanize him as he had given of his body to beget him. But Gaius and Titius cannot believe that in calling such a death sweet and seemly, they would be saying something important about something.
In other words, his death, well, that's just your emotion about the death. It's nothing more.
About something. Their own method of debunking would cry out against them if they attempted to do so. For death is not something to eat, and therefore cannot be dolce in the literal sense. And it is unlikely that the real sensations preceding it will be dolce even by analogy. And as for decorum, that is only a word describing how some other people will feel about your death when they happen to think of it, which won't be often, and will certainly do you no good. There are only two courses open to Gaius and Titius. Either they must go the whole way and debunk this sentiment like any other, or must set themselves to work to produce from outside a sentiment which they believe to be of no value to the pupil, and which may cost him his life, because it is useful to us, the survivors, that our young men should feel it.
Now we're treading on the way of Matt Dillahunty. And well, why do I seek to preserve my life? Because my ancestors did. So it's a feeling. It's an instinct. We're going to get into instinct later in this book.
Our young men should feel it. If they embark on this course, the difference between the old and the new education will be an important one. Where the old initiated, the new merely conditions. The old dealt with its pupils as grown birds deal with young birds when they teach them to fly. The new deals with them more as the poultry keeper deals with young birds, making them thus or thus, for purposes of which the birds know nothing. In a word, the old was a kind of propagation, men transmitting manhood to men. The new is merely propaganda. It is to their credit that Gaius and Titius embrace the first alternative. Propaganda is their abomination, not because their own philosophy gives a ground for condemning it, or anything else, but because they are better than their principles. They probably have some vague notion, I will examine it in my next lecture, that valor and good faith and justice could be sufficiently commended to the pupil on what they would call rational or biological or modern grounds.
This is exactly the project here 50-plus years later.
If it should ever become necessary. In the meantime, they leave the matter alone and get on with the business of debunking. But this course, though less inhuman, is not less disastrous than the opposite alternative of cynical propaganda. Let us suppose for a moment that the harder virtues could really be theoretically justified with no appeal to objective value. It still remains true that no justification of virtue will enable a man to be virtuous. Without the aid of trained emotions, the intellect is powerless against the animal organism. I had sooner play cards against a man who was quite sceptical about ethics, but bred to believe that a gentleman does not cheat, than against an irreproachable moral philosopher who had been brought up among sharpers.
Here Lewis makes the point that you can talk about ethics all day long, but this actually is what gets trained into us, and gets trained into us from very young. And this for Lewis means, well, that's why this issue of the school books is important. Because as Dallas Willard noted, this gets brought into you by body language, by status conversation, and not directly through the front door.
In battle, it is not syllogisms that will keep the reluctant nerves and muscles to their post in the third hour of the bombardment.
And remember, Lewis was a veteran of the First World War. He was in those bunkers. He was in those trenches. He was wounded in battle, which what ended the war for him, and fortunately for him, he was wounded in such a way that he survived, and it wouldn't let him back into the war.
The crudest sentimentalism, such as Gaius and Titius would wince at, about a flag or a country or a regiment will be of more use. We were told it.
In other words, this is the irony. You can go ahead and debunk the flag, but when your country is assaulted, well, now suddenly you want to bring the flag out. Well, you've just undercut the whole thing and said all those are mere emotion. You could feel one way about a flag and feel another way about another flag. What does it matter? There's no reason to get upset by any of it.
We were told it all long ago by Plato. As the king governs by his executive, so reason in man must rule the mere appetites by means of the spirited element. The head rules the belly through the chest, the seat, as Alanus tells us, of magnanimity, of emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiments. The chest, magnanimity, sentiment, these are the indispensable liaison officers between cerebral man and visceral man. It may even be said that it is by this middle element that man is man, for by his intellect he is mere spirit, and by his appetite mere animal. The operation of the Green Book and its kind is to produce what may be called men without chests. It is an outrage that they should be commonly spoken of as intellectuals. This gives them the chance to say that he who attacks them attacks intelligence. It is not so. They are not distinguished from other men by any unusual skill in finding truth, nor any virginal ardour to pursue her. Indeed, it would be strange if they were. A persevering devotion to truth, a nice sense of intellectual honour, cannot be long maintained without the aid of a sentiment which Gaius and Titius could debunk as easily as any other. It is not excess of thought, but defect of fertile and generous emotion that marks them out. Their heads are no bigger than the ordinary. It is the atrophy of the chest beneath that makes them seem so.
And here they're basically saying, where's the ardor? Well, you can debunk any ardor because any emotion is mere emotion. If your mother dies in front of you, brutally murdered, well, what do you feel? Outrage? Well, outrage is a mere emotion. It has no correspondence to the crime that has been committed in front of you. You've just undercut the whole business. Now, fortunately, again, they're better than their principles.
So. And all the time, such is the tragic comedy of our situation, we continue to clamour for those very qualities we are rendering impossible. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that what our civilization needs is more drive, or dynamism, or self-sacrifice, or creativity. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honour and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful.
That last line, Lewis is such a master. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. It's exactly what we're doing. All those emotions that get stirred up of beauty. You see beauty. There's meaning, there's truth, there's things to live for, there's things to die for. You know, in many ways, the entire Jordan Peterson phenomenon is utterly predictable because at some point, once it's all been debunked and what you say, well, I'm just having feelings. That's all I'm having. Okay. But is there nothing to be angry about? Sam Harris gets angry. He rises up in righteous indignation about abuse of religion. Okay. But what within your system allows you to do that? That is what he's weak on. That is what he can't explain. That is what they're talking about. But none of them on stage doubt the fact that we ought to do better than the chimps. Well, why? Is there perhaps a moral order? Is there perhaps, can we use values, can use predicates of value that actually correspond to something? Well, what kind of a world would enable that kind of existence? That's what we're talking about.